Good morning. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Hudson. My name is Marilyn Orr, President of the club, and we are thrilled to have you join us today. This meeting broadcast is available on HCTV, as well as our Rotary of Hudson YouTube channel and Facebook. Our club meets weekly using this digital platform, Zoom. When we meet in person, it's at Laurel Lake Retirement Community for breakfast. We hope to get back to that soon. We meet most Wednesday mornings from 7:15 to 8:30 a.m. So come out to join us for a meeting. We would love to have you as a guest. To learn more about Rotary, our club, and the impact we are having on our local community and the world, please visit our website, rotaryhudson.org. So enjoy this meeting today and help us share the message that Rotary opens doors of opportunity.
And we're ready.
Good morning, Rotarians. Welcome to our weekly morning meeting here on Zoom, and hope everybody is well. I am replacing, for the week only, Mr. Ron Strobel. He's out and about. We don't know where, but he's out and about. So we welcome you on this day, and Jim Young, you're going to let us know who's doing the prayer this morning, please.
It's Catherine. Catherine's doing the prayer.
All right, Catherine.
Okay, so
Take
please
it away,
join,
Catherine.
please join me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for letting us work with you to share your joy with the world. Help us to serve our community and our neighbors. Help us to have open eyes to see the needs around us and to respond to those needs. Give us strength and guidance. Thank you for your love and care. Amen.
Amen. And then I think for our pledge and our four-way test, it's going to be Bill, right?
That's right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And the four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill, better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, Bill, for doing that for us. And just want to let you know, being back here in Ohio versus Las Vegas, there's about a 50-degree difference. So enjoy this weather because it is super, super hot out in there, out in the desert. Marilyn, anything else you'd like for me to say?
No, I don't think so. I think we're ready to take it away.
All right. With that being said, Marilyn, it's your table.
Thank you very much, Rich. Good morning, Rotarians and guests. This is the last Rotary meeting of the 2020-2021 Rotary year. Next week, we will be hosting our recognition and awards event. And it's with great pride that I'm announcing that Marty Hills is the winner of the Jimmy Sutphin Award for this year. We will also be awarding a Rotarian of the Year and several Paul Harris Awards. What a great way to close out this year. We will be meeting at the Twinsburg Blue Canyon Kitchen and Grill on June 30th at 6 p.m. We'll start our evening with a self-pay bar with appetizers, follow with a lovely dinner and dessert, and the presentation of the awards and the induction of President Patrick Scheer and the new board of directors. It promises to be a lot of fun. And then the new year starts with hybrid meetings. We'll be meeting at Hudson Meadows on Barlow Road. We'll be meeting both in person with Zoom availability for those who are unable to attend. We will still be recording our meetings for Hudson Community TV, Facebook, and our YouTube channel. At Hudson Meadows, a continental breakfast will be available starting at 7 a.m. So set your clocks ahead with pastries, yogurt, and fruit parfaits and beverages in their pub area. And at 7:30, we will adjourn to their theater room for our meeting. And so indeed, it will be a brand new year. This is the last of our programs this month based on history. David Basil has been really busy reaching out within our community and beyond to bring us great content. So David, please introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, President Marilyn. I am thrilled and honored to be able to introduce this morning Jim Triesler. Jim has been the Director of Education at the Virginia War Memorial since October of 2015. For 20 years, he has taught social studies at Clover Hill High School in Chesterfield County, Virginia. He and his students were the recipients of a Save Our History Award from the History Channel for their class project on World War II. That was in 2007. He was named Chesterfield County, Virginia Teacher of the Year and the Virginia State Region 1 Teacher of the Year. Jim is passionate about the study of history, especially the history of World War II. He has interviewed over 200 World War II veterans, and in January of this year was named the official historian of the National Battle of the Bulge Association. He and his wife have been married for 33 years. They have one son, Jonathan, who is currently playing baseball in the minor leagues in Alpine, Texas. Please join me in giving a warm Rotary welcome to Jim Triesler. Jim, I will turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you, Dave, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up? Or great, fantastic. You know, as I was listening to my bio, one of the things that I don't think really comes out is that when I was teaching high school, I had a passion for getting the community as involved as possible in my classroom and with the students. And I was always bringing in guest speakers, and a dynamic that I had was that, you know, for years, students would write essays for me, trying to, you know, get that letter grade, that A, and make me happy. And I changed that dynamics where I started looking for essay contests nationally. And all of a sudden, my students were writing an essay for the National World War II Museum down in Louisiana, or they were writing for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Massachusetts. And I became a facilitator to assist them. And, you know, I wasn't the end goal. That grade wasn't the end product. And they were trying to write the best essay they could to compete at a national level. So we did a lot with the Sons of the American Revolution and the Daughters of the American Revolution. And people would come in and actually work with my students from those organizations. And the end result was my students were 11th and 12th grade, and they were building their resume. And the last 4 years that I was in the classroom, my students won $13,000 for their homework and were building their resume for college. So it was a different way to teach. It took me about 15 years to figure that out, but it was pretty amazing to see them doing projects and getting recognized by the Virginia Historical Society at that time and other organizations. So what I told them was that instead of just learning history for a quiz and then forgetting about it, I told them that they had to give back to the historical community through projects. And we had a group of students that would actually take original World War II artifacts to our local middle schools, our feeder schools. And the students would have to present to the middle school students, because they always say, you know, you learn best what you teach, because you have to do a lot of preparation to teach it. So that was my way of giving back to the historical community. Well, almost 6 years ago, I came to the Virginia War Memorial. That was one of the locations that I would bring my students regularly to meet with veterans, because veterans from World War II to the present were volunteers here. They were doing a lot of education programs, and I wanted my students to learn about the history from the people who lived it, where they could say, you know, what did you see? How did you feel? Things like that, and really get to know the veterans and the history that way. So I'm happy that 4 of my students have gone on to work in the museum field, which I'm incredibly pleased about. We had over 8,000 original World War II letters in our classroom that we were working on a big project. And instead of a 1-year big project, the project went on for 16 years. And I was very excited about that. And we had a lot of World War II veterans come in and talk with the students, even some German ones. I thought, you know, if they want to learn the whole story, they better hear it from both sides. And that was just fascinating. So, you know, none of the German soldiers came in saying that they were right. They all said that they had lost their youth, basically. And, you know, they talked about what a sad thing it was for what happened to Germany, you know, based on their leadership at that time. But anyway, so it's very exciting to be here today. I know this is not the speech you signed up for. So for about, I guess, 17 or 18 years, I've been going to Battle of the Bulge reunions. My late father-in-law was a Bulge veteran. And we've lost so many. I feel like now I go to an awful lot of funerals for World War II veterans, but I promised them that my job was to carry on their stories. And, as long as I'm around, they're not going to be forgotten. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge. Our previous historian was there for about 35 years, worked for the federal government in Washington, D.C., and was just an amazing individual. And there's some big shoes for me to fill. But I'm very honored to try to fill John Bowen's shoes as our historian. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and see if I can share my screen. And if I can do this correctly, we will have a PowerPoint on the Battle of the Bulge. So let's see. Okay, not sure. Are you seeing a full screen that says?
We are absolutely seeing it. It looks great.
Fantastic. All right, good deal. So here we have, again, I called it Cold as the Devil, Stories from the Battle of the Bulge. It's a program that I did back in 2020, and I've tweaked it some since then. And I really should have given you the shorter version, but I'm afraid it's going to be a longer version. So some of the slides we may just go through pretty quickly. But that's my father-in-law actually in this cover on the right side there with the smile. And he was in the artillery. And we're going to hear a little bit from him today also. Down at the bottom is the Virginia War Memorial where I work. And I'm going to go ahead and show you the campus. We think it's the best war memorial in the country, but we have had several expansions. And we cover from all the way in the left with our 20th century shrine, all the way over as far as you can see to the right with our 21st century shrine. And we opened in 1956 as a memorial for World War II and Korea. And the names of those Virginians who were killed in battle at the hands of the enemy are listed in that shrine. The white statue that's at the end of that shrine is called Memory. And Memory represents all the women who lost loved ones in those early wars, early for us, of World War II and Korea. When Vietnam came about, they added some glass panels. What's a little difficult for you to see is that between all those pillars are glass panels with names etched in the glass. And on the stone walls that are on the other side of both shrines, there are names etched in the stone. So again, we try to honor those Virginians. Now, my students always told me they hated history because it was just names and dates. Well, so what do we have? 2 shrines full of names and dates. So what we try to do is learn as much as we can about these men and women that we honor. Can we find some photographs? Can we get some stories about their service and about their lives? And we have a database where we're gathering information so that we can continue to honor them without their names just being, just names and dates that don't mean anything on a wall. This is, it looks orange because the sun is coming up on the James River. We overlook the James River and it's a beautiful sight. What I didn't tell you in the last picture is that in between the 2 shrines, we have museum space that show military uniforms from the American Revolution up to the present. We have the Amori flag, which is a flag that was created by POWs in the Amori prison in Tokyo. It's an American flag that they risked their lives to create. We have a piece of the Pentagon from 9/11. We are about to acquire a piece of the World Trade Center. The USS Arizona that was bombed when Pearl Harbor started, we actually have a piece of that on display. We have lots of flight jackets. We have a Medal of Honor gallery. We have a Veterans Art Gallery. We have a movie theater and have produced 22 movies that have a lot of veteran original footage and interviews intermixed to teach. And we've provided all those movies to teachers for free around the state. And we have a research center. We have an archivist on staff, a curator on staff, and it's a pretty special place. It's really a great place to do programming and live out, if you love history, it's a great place to work. So our big focus probably is on programming for middle and high school, but we added contests just because my students used to participate in contests. We have a poetry gallery. We have an art contest in the spring for middle and high school, and we have an essay contest in the fall. And the winners of the essay contest are invited to come and read their essays at our Veterans Day program. They have their photograph taken with Virginia's governor, and their teachers also receive some money for sponsoring them. So we're trying to do a lot to provide resources. We have a lot of letters we collect, photographs. We try to make those available to teachers. And we want to be just a great resource for education. And thanks to Zoom over the past year, it's not just Virginia, but we're starting to spread nationwide, which is very exciting. Again, it's orange here from the sunrise over the James River. You can see a memory at the end of our 20th century shrine. This is what the wall, one of the walls looks like. After Vietnam was added, the Persian Gulf was added, and then the global war on terror got its own second shrine, which was off to the right of our first photograph. So our mission at the top is to honor veterans, preserve history, educate youth, and inspire patriotism in all. And I think here with our staff of about 11, that we do a pretty good job every day fulfilling our mission. So, Cold as the Devil, Stories from the Battle of the Bulge. You know, I love to share this picture because it's Hitler in 1936, and you can see, you know, the love that the crowd has for him. But what I think is so fascinating is there's an American flag in the background, which looks really unusual. Now, right away, if you know your history, you're thinking, oh, I bet that's the 1936 Olympics, and those are the American athletes. And if that's what you're thinking, you'd be exactly correct. So, you know, Hitler during this time period, although he was trying to put a good face to the world because, you know, Berlin was hosting the Olympics, behind the scenes, you know, they're building weapons. And Hitler had been in the trenches in World War I, and he knew poison gas. He knew the horrors of no man's land. And he said, we're not going to do that again. We're going to have lightning warfare. We're going to have blitzkrieg, and we're going to build, you know, boats and trucks and tanks and, you know, dive bombers and you name it. And, you know, we're going to have rockets and just really build all this stuff and take over what he perceived as his enemies in just a matter of weeks. You know, he could overrun a country. So that's what he's working on behind the scenes. Once they took over Paris in 1940, these are some of the German soldiers in Paris, and the general at the podium is General von Rundstedt. And again, you know, the Germans came in and occupied, really by 1941, and the time we entered the war, they're occupying from the Channel all the way, you know, to Moscow, just outside of Moscow in the Soviet Union. One thing a lot of students and people don't think about is that when the Germans took over a country, they sent the young people back to work in factories or to go into the German military. And that even includes, you know, French children and children from Luxembourg and Belgium. You know, once you hit 18, you were told you've got to be in the German army, or, you know, if you're female, you've got to be back working in factories in Germany. So by the time the first British bombs are being dropped in 1940, there were 150,000 guest workers, which somebody said yesterday, you mean hostages, basically, that were in Berlin alone. And I think it made it a little easier for the Germans to control France, for example, if you know that your young people are working back in Germany, you know. So anyhow, the Germans were very much about labor and raw materials, and, you know, they saw the people that they conquered as just a resource for them to use. They would take their food, they would take their belongings, their wealth, and send it back to Germany. So when we land, you know, this is what we're up against, actually. Europe in 1941, one of the things I love to share with students is that when Pearl Harbor was attacked, you know, this is what Europe looked like. Plus, with Italy, you know, the Mediterranean was under control of the Axis powers. North Africa was under control of the Axis powers. And now that our Pacific fleet had been hit, you know, our ships are damaged in Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese have landed troops around much of the Pacific Rim. So at that moment, it would have been really easy for us to say, we can't win this, you know, and just sue for peace and give up. But we didn't give up. You know, we did everything it took. You know, up to 16 million men and women went in the military. A lot of those ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, we refloated them and sent them into battle against the Japanese. And I'll tell students, that's what it is to be an American, that when your fleet is on the bottom of the harbor, you don't give up. You say, what do I need to do to patch those up and send those back into battle? On the home front, our grandmothers and great-grandmothers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers went to work in factories around the clock and produced enough material to supply our troops, Britain's troops, the Soviet Union. The work they did was incredible. And even children, at home were doing rubber drives and bond competitions and metal drives to get scrap metal, and paper drives, and everybody's planning victory gardens and doing everything they can to help win the war. So it's pretty impressive what people did, but we had to do that because our enemies had a 2-year head start. So this is a write-up of describing the Battle of the Bulge from the Army's website. And it just mentions that, the reason why we're skipping ahead is, Germany is controlling Europe. And finally, in 1941, the Russians are starting to really push back in the east. And they're waiting for us to land at Normandy in the west. And finally, in 1944, we land at Normandy. We start pushing the Germans back to the German border. But Hitler has a plan that he needs to break through our lines, get to the port city of Antwerp, Belgium, where he can capture gasoline and supplies that his army desperately needs to continue the fight. So basically, it's saying here it's a 75-mile stretch of the front characterized by dense woods, few roads, and it was held by inexperienced and battle-worn American divisions. I think it's interesting. How can you be inexperienced and battle-worn? But when you think about it, a lot of the men that had been lost were being replaced by replacement troops. So there were a lot of inexperienced troops that were there resting, in the forest of the Ardennes. So this is a map that was created here at the War Memorial. And it shows that, the line was pretty much a relatively straight line running north-south along the German border. But then on December 16th, 1944, boom, the Germans hit and break this salient. They try to break our lines. The lines stretch, but they do not break. And this is as far as the Germans get. You can see Antwerp is up to the north in Belgium. And that, again, was Hitler's ultimate target, was to capture Antwerp so he could get the fuel. So they said the story, again, from the Army, the story of the Battle of the Bulge is the story of American soldiers, often isolated and unaware of the overall picture. They did their part to slow the Nazi advance, whether by delaying armored spearheads with obstinate defenses of vital crossroads, moving or burning critical gasoline stocks to keep them from the fuel-hungry German tanks, or coming up with questions on arcane Americana to stump possible Nazi infiltrators. We didn't know the attack was going to come, especially in this large scale. But we did know that the Germans had put out a call for German soldiers that spoke English. And it turned out what they were doing was putting them in American uniforms, dressing them like military policemen, and then dropping them behind our lines where they could take control of bridges and crossroads and basically, create havoc when we're trying to advance and move troops. And the signs have been changed, leading you away from a town when you think you're going to a town. So one way to find out if these MPs were actually, German or not, was to ask them questions like, maybe a question about Betty Grable, or, who's the first baseman for the Cleveland Indians, things like that. And that's how they would reveal who some of these spies were. So here's the Germans advancing very quickly, and time was of the essence. And that some of the brutality, I think, with prisoners of war possibly happened because of the time constraint. They knew that they had to get to Antwerp by a certain time, or they were going to run out of gas, and that was going to be the end of the attack. So, this is a quote from D. Paris, who was a tank commander with the 9th Armored Division. His group would actually get to the Remagen Bridge, which was the last bridge over the Rhine River. And during the Battle of the Bulge, he mentioned, that his group arrived on December 14th. Our commanding officers went forward to meet with the infantry officers to plan how we would move through them and attack, but it never came about because on the 16th, the Germans attacked in force. We were in the area of St. Vith, which was the main German attack. The 5th Panzer Army attacked our area. From St. Vith, the Germans were to go to the port of Antwerp, where all the American supplies were pouring in. So if we skip down, he mentions Colonel Piper was leading part of the German attack, and he was known as a murderer in Russia. He was very brutal in the way he attacked people. The attack was a surprise to us, and the next 6 days were very confusing because, again, they're in thick woods and the weather was poor, so it became very difficult to really know what was going on. Here's a more official map of the Ardennes, and there's a line that runs again north-south, which was our original line on December 15th. But then by 10 days later, the Germans have advanced where this yellowish off-white line is. And what some just important cities on this, Bastogne was completely surrounded here in the south. Houffalize was an important key crossroads town, and it's going to be leveled by us. We're going to bomb it very badly. Houffalize is a beautiful town, by the way, today. If you get a chance to visit, I highly recommend it. Here's St. Vith, which is the area where D. Paris was just now. And Malmedy, where some of our prisoners were massacred by Piper and his men, is right here just above St. Vith. So this is the general map of what was going on. And Antwerp, their goal was way up here in the upper left, okay? And of course, they never achieved that goal. Well, this is a picture of D. Paris, and he mentions that the 106th Infantry had to, they surrendered. They were surrounded. Two of the units surrendered. So I say units, regiments actually surrendered. So he said, I have my 5 tanks and I might be sent down to a bridge one day, protected from the Germans, crossing it the next day. I might be on a ridge the next day, ordered to hold a crossroads or something else. Missions every day, and you didn't know where you were or what you were doing. We were constantly moving. We supported the 106th, which had 2 regiments surrender on the second day. Del Bordner was in a mortar squad with the 26th Infantry. And he mentioned that they had 60 millimeter mortars and light machine guns. They were attached to an infantry company. Del in this photograph is the man on the right holding his helmet. And he said we had a forward observer that would call back and give us the range on where they wanted the fire put in. They didn't do it by radio. They tried to run telephone lines. And to fire a mortar, you have to have a good line of fire. They were in the forest, which made it really difficult to fire. So since they were surrounded by trees and couldn't fire their mortars in early January, they were made a bazooka battalion or bazooka group. So here he said, it was highly forested. Again, we're going to put you into bazooka teams. He said Dave Verdugo and I had a little experience with the bazooka, but the rest of the guys had absolutely no experience, but they could carry ammunition. So on January 9th, the battalion advanced 1,000 meters against stubborn resistance. Now that was great, except Del Bordner didn't make it the whole 1,000. He said, I got out 25 or 30 meters when a bullet hit him in the neck. A medic gave him first aid, cut away his clothing. And he said, we didn't have winter clothing, but the Germans did. And he bandaged me up, and fortunately I could walk. Many of the guys that got wounded froze to death because it was below 0 that day. He went through a series of aid stations and finally got back to a general hospital. They performed surgery, and the doctor told me, you're lucky, young man, because the bullet missed your spine by ½ an inch. And in this photograph, those are some German soldiers in the snow that are firing against us. And what's interesting here is that, let's see, there was a part I wanted to expand on. Well, below 0, that's what it was. The fact that it was below 0 that day, that's Fahrenheit. And this was the coldest winter in Europe in at least 30 years. It was a brutally cold winter. And he mentioned our men are wounded. If you couldn't walk, they often just froze to death where they fell. It was really difficult. So here, Del tells a story at the end of the war where he was told that some Hungarians wanted to surrender. So he and 2 other men went up to see what the deal was. And it turned out there were 100 to 120 fully armed men with their rifles and everything. And he said there was a Hungarian major with them, but they didn't speak English and he didn't speak Hungarian. So what happened is, he said the interpreter saluted him. They saluted each other. He offered his pistol for surrender. But Del Bordner said, it's getting dark, so we're going to stay here overnight. By the way, Mr. Bordner's from Ohio. But he said in the morning, we gathered weapons and marched 120 prisoners to the work camp. It went smoothly, but it could have been a disaster. What could have been a disaster was at night, he was like, it was late. And when he just said, hold on to your weapons, stay fully armed. And in the morning, we'll deal with it. What if they changed their mind overnight and didn't want to surrender? But luckily, it worked out okay. This is John McAuliffe, who lived in Massachusetts, and He mentions that they were in a clump of woods, that the German 88 artillery pieces were incredibly accurate. They would fire at a good distance. And in the forest, these artillery pieces would hit trees and then splinters go everywhere. So you're not only worried about pieces of bomb fragments, shrapnel, you're worried about splinters falling down. So he said he and his buddy hid under a tree, and a guy next to him, after the attack was wrapping up, a guy next to him stood up and his knee had been blown open. And he said he didn't seek shelter. He just stood up. His knee was wide open, and we started calling for the medics. So we don't always give the recognition to the nurses that they need, but I've had a good opportunity to meet several nurses, including Kate Nolan, who's in this picture. Kate lived in Florida, and Kate talked about the different types of hospitals that they had. And by the way, Kate said, you know what? A lot of our men survived because we got our field hospitals right up there close to the front lines. So that usually if someone was wounded, within an hour, the medics had them in the field hospital receiving treatment. And she said a lot of our men survived thanks to that. So she said from the field hospitals, you were sent to an evacuation hospital and eventually back to a general hospital, that you had 3 hours to set up your field hospital. And sometimes the wounded would arrive before they were ready. So they would set up the tents in the order that they were needed. So you would have the shock tent, then the x-ray tent, then the surgery tent, and the post-op tent. And if you had enough time, you'd set up your own personal tent so you didn't have to sleep on the ground. But sometimes the wounded did arrive soon, and the nurses and medical staff had to sleep on the ground. This is a picture of the 47th Field Hospital. You can see generators, tents. It would have been much larger than what you see here. You can tell it was muddy, so they put down wooden sidewalks. And imagine that as the front lines moved, you would have to pack all this up and quickly move, including the wounded and the medicines and the equipment. And it was quite a job. Kate said when they were in England practicing that the nurses were asked to carry full heavy backpacks on 10-mile hikes. And they were also given the job of setting up and breaking down field hospitals. So they practiced this in England so that when they got over near the front, they could do it quickly. This is Jack King. Jack wrote a series of letters to his mom. Basically, on December 10th, which is 6 days before the battle starts, he mentions that all is quiet and that they've been singing Christmas carols and things. They're getting in the holiday spirit. Jack had no idea what was waiting for him. Here's Jack and some of the nurses from his field hospital. And another letter on the 14th, he says they've been quite busy, but if you don't hear from me, I'm okay. My time is pretty well occupied. I know this is a grainy photograph, but a lot of these photos are original unpublished photographs that the soldiers had. And this was in Jack's collection. And it shows wounded men in cots. And there's a nurse actually kneeling between two cots in this photograph. Here's another picture that belonged to Jack. And now the battle has started. He said he hasn't written for several days as there's been no time. In the past 4 days, I've had some very exciting experiences. Suffice it to say now that the war drew very close to me, but I'm still fine and dandy. This bunch of fellows is at its best in a tight spot. So he just basically tells his mom not to worry. Now here's a picture of Jack in the snow. It's a couple days after Christmas, and he said, been a little while since I've had a chance to write. Things have been a bit unsettled here, and Christmas came along. Even with the situation confused, the Army had fresh eggs for us on Christmas morning, and we had turkey and all the trimmings for dinner. The few days before Christmas were very exciting. I hope this counterattack will be turned into a big victory for us. It can be, and I pray that it will end the war. And sure enough, once the attack fails, the counterattack pushes the Germans back. And at that point, it's only about 3.5 months till the war is over in Europe. So it was successful. I love it that the Army worked hard to get them a special meal for Christmas. And because of censorship, Jack was not able to tell specifics about what was going on. So he has to say things like a bit unsettled here. He writes in early January, again, that they have been moving about for quite a time. Remember, those hospitals are very difficult to move. And he said that we've been to 6 places since we left the place I stayed so long. So again, he can't tell where he was. But just that idea that in the past, 2 weeks, he's moved at least 6 times shows how difficult it was on the doctors. Also, he gets a letter from December 11th, so the mail is now about 3 weeks behind. So that's kind of frustrating. But this is a photo of a truck showing, the medical crew, everybody getting loaded up to move the hospital. Here is a Jeep that's stuck in the snow. The snow started pretty heavily a few days into the battle. And he writes on January 8th, everything's okay. He hates to see snow because it slows down their air power, which Hitler knew, which is why he attacked in a time period when it would be cloudy and bad weather. He said that still hoping for an early victory and a quick return home. And then he cracks. He's very polite all the way through, but his frustration leaks out here. And he says, I get pretty damn tired of it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'd give a month's pay tonight to have a date, go dancing, to a show, or do something that's near normal for a change. So you can understand that the stress of not only working with the wounded, but the stress of the Germans advancing and the lines shifting and having to move and pack the hospitals, it was just getting pretty great for Jack. And he finally actually started to vent a little frustration in this letter. On the 14th, you see the nurses and medics had a snowball fight. And he said, things here are about the same. It's been cold, but we aren't exposed to the elements, like those men at the front, who many of them were in their foxholes. My father-in-law used to tell me that I have his big overcoat, and he would say, Jim, I'd fall asleep wearing that overcoat. I was so tired from the fighting. And I'd wake up in the morning and there'd be 3 inches of snow on me. And I didn't even realize it was snowing. I was so tired. But here he's saying that, he had lost his radio in one of the moves, but they found it with the x-ray equipment. And that it was a beautiful day with the sun reflecting on the snow. And it makes a fellow feel a bit homesick, but we're all hoping it won't be too long now. So the battle is starting to wind down. On January 22nd, he mentions here, again, don't worry. The Germans are steadily retreating and withdrawing from their salient in Belgium. And he says, my luck, I'll be back. I know I will. And here's a picture of a nurse at one of the tents at his hospital. Finally, the battle's over. Remember, we started with Jack writing, things are quiet, and we're singing Christmas carols. Well, here we are where he says, dear mom, things are quiet. Love, Jack. So it's like bookends. It started quiet, it's ending quiet. But one difference you might see here is now that they've been very close to the battle, you see that the nurses are actually wearing helmets at this point in this photograph. So here's another picture. I know it's grainy, but it's a picture showing them moving one of the hospitals. And there's a large building, like a school building in the background. Whenever they could take over a building, they would. But anyhow, a lot of times they were in the tents. Well, Rose Young was a nurse at the 130th General Hospital, and she just talked about the metal cots and that they would bring in the wounded. And Rose was the only one assessing the wounded and whether or not they went to surgery or not. And she said it was, 24 hours a day for 10 days during the battle. There were over 80,000 American men, soldiers, wounded in this battle. So the number of wounded coming into our field hospitals was just incredible. And Rose had to deal with that overwhelming number. So she said she had these rows of cots, and there was a stretcher with a wounded soldier on it. And on the floor in between the cots, there were stretchers with wounded soldiers, all wrapped in army blankets. And she said every 3 hours, all of them got penicillin, and her job was to determine which ones went to surgery first. And you didn't have time to unwrap all their blankets, or if they had an overcoat, to take off that overcoat. So you just would run your hand under the stretcher, and the ones that had the most blood through the blankets were the ones you said, take this one. You didn't have time to get their arms out, check blood pressure, determine who was in shock. She said, you just used your eyes and your feeling. This is a picture of Rose, and she said, we didn't have time to think. We never thought about food. What they did was to bring a big tray of sandwiches up from the kitchen whenever somebody had the time to go there and make sandwiches. And they'd walk around with a sandwich in one hand, and she'd be changing, bloody bandages with the other. A week would pass where she couldn't even change her uniform, and she was just a mess. The nurses did say that they would write for red lipstick and red fingernail polish, because for one, the fingernail polish helped cover the dirt on their hands and like the stains, and the lipstick just made them feel like a woman. They said at times they just wanted to feel like a woman. This is a schoolhouse they were in, and the battle outside these windows was raging while they were working with both German and American wounded inside. And Rose said they were looking out the window and they noticed at one point the battle was slowing down and all the troops outside were German. They had actually fallen behind enemy lines. So what she describes here is that they made arrangements and came during the middle of the night and took us out of there. We walked with them and they took us with round flashlights through the fields. We couldn't even go on the roads. We had to go through farm fields until we got to one of the main roads, and they had a truck waiting for us. They put us on the back of the truck and drove us down to where the rest of the unit was in France. And the they that she's talking about was actually a group of African-American soldiers who were sent to rescue the staff of that hospital behind enemy lines. Bob Diedrich was a volunteer here where I work, and he's been gone for quite a few years now. But he just talked about how he was a lead observer, a forward observer, and he would have to go in front and then, call back to the unit on where to fire. His job was to adjust the artillery fire onto the targets. Bob did get wounded as a forward observer, and even as an older man, he would never talk about it. He would get upset if you asked him to talk about the day he was wounded. So I stopped pursuing that line of questioning and never did hear what happened the day he was wounded. Here, Bob told us that he was in Holland when the battle started. Basically, they were trying to get to St. Vith, but they never got there. And he said that they were constantly engaged in fighting. I was never out of the battle all the way from the beginning to the end. This is my father-in-law just talking about firing howitzers, that you use bags of gunpowder, put it in, would send the shells off that they could fire up to 9 miles. He had the large 155 millimeter howitzer. And it was tough. One thing, he was a very devout man, and often the Germans would use church steeples for, a sniper or somebody who's spying on their movements. And Fred would get orders to say, orders to blow up a church steeple. And that always grieved him so much, but he had to follow orders and he had to do it. So anyhow, that's a little bit about my father-in-law. Here, this is a sign for a minefield. And one day he told a story, which is really sad, that he said the engineers used to come and they would gather up the mines and put a rope on them and pull them into a pile and then detonate them. But he said that his lieutenant didn't want to wait for the engineers to clear a minefield. So he just selected 4 untrained soldiers to do it. And they were all killed. And my father-in-law said he was one that was assigned to go out and try to retrieve what was left of these 4 soldiers. And the rest of his life, when he would share this incident, he would cry, that he could still see it. It was still very painful. And he was still very angry that the lieutenant wouldn't wait for the trained engineers to come to remove the mines. This is my father-in-law just doing a quick description of the battle. It was cold. The hardest part for the soldier was the cold, the snow, the sleet, the freezing rain, or frozen fingers, frozen feet, stuff like that. There were a lot of cases of frostbite. There were times when you didn't sleep for days. It was unreal, and the snow was up to your hips. Russell Cobb was in the 84th Infantry Division and was the BAR man, which was a large weapon. You had to be big and strong to carry it. And he mentioned there that we got into a firefight and I was firing, but didn't know where or what or anything. I couldn't see anything. He said we were fighting for Houffalize, and about 3 weeks later we had retaken it, but it was pretty much flat by then. And this is a photograph of what Houffalize looked like in 1945 with the German tank in the river. Again, it's been rebuilt. It is a gorgeous town today. This is really funny, and we're getting close to the end. But Russell Cobb said that he was exhausted outside of Houffalize, leaning on a fence, and a Jeep pulled up and it said, "Soldier, where are your galoshes?" And he said, "Galoshes? We don't have galoshes. Nobody's got galoshes." And the officer said, "Soldier, give me your name and I'll have your galoshes." And he said, "Well, get the galoshes for the whole company. We all need them." And the guy got back into the Jeep and the driver came over and said, "Do you know who that was?" And I said, "No, and I don't really care." That's how tired he was from the fighting. And the driver said, "Well, that was General Patton." So Russell was not very respectful, but Patton loved a good fighter. And I think it was obvious to Patton that Russell Cobb was exhausted from combat and doing his job. And I'm sure Patton had respect for that. This is Francis Chesko. He was an engineer. The engineers don't get a lot of credit, but under enemy fire, they had to build pontoon bridges across the rivers. And here they built a pontoon bridge 1,300 feet across the Rhine. And here's a picture of what that bridge looked like that Francis Chesko helped work on. It amazes me that a bridge held up by boats can allow tanks and trucks to cross it. It's just a real engineering feat. Francis just went on and told a story about a German tank coming. And anyway, I'm going to skip that one for time's sake. This is Al Rosenzweig. Al had frozen feet at the Battle of the Bulge. And Al told me, and I'm going to conclude on this. Al said, Jim, I had frozen feet and I felt the effects of it for the rest of my life. And see, as a teacher, when we teach about the war, we tell everybody the war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945. The students write it in their notebook, they memorize that date, and then they want to move on to a new unit, study something else. But for the soldiers and nurses that lived through this battle, it didn't end on May 8th for them. They carried the effects of it their whole lives. Al told me that he would get out of bed, and he was from Dallas, Texas. He had a beautiful voice, and he would say, Jim, every morning I stood up on faith that my feet would hold me because I could not feel from my ankles down to my toes. And that was for over 70 years. He couldn't feel his feet when he got up in the morning. And that was an effect of the Battle of the Bulge. Harold Blaylock was a prisoner of war who was locked in a rail car, and they didn't paint PW on the roof for prisoner of war. And our planes came over and bombed the train. And fortunately, he wasn't injured, but the event was so horrific to him that he had to see somebody for his claustrophobia the rest of his life. He had to see counselors for it. He couldn't get in a small shower. He couldn't get in an elevator because he'd been locked in a rail car for so long as a prisoner. Al Lopes was fighting in the Pacific Theater, but had jungle rot. And I went to see him at his house, and he wanted to show me his jungle rot. And I said, no, thank you. But you can't stop a man from showing you his jungle rot. And he took off his shoes and socks. And he said, I've had this rash on my ankle since 1944. And Joe Keller had a Japanese hand grenade explode and put fragments of metal in his arm. And as an older man, he said that he'd have red splotches on his arm where pieces of hand grenade were working their way out. And Fred Whirl, my father-in-law, would have nightmares of fighting the Germans and would scream out in his sleep, which he lived with us the last 6 years of his life. So I've heard it. And it was amazing how, he was there in combat in his sleep. So my point is this, that these men and women went to war for the duration, meaning that they didn't know when they were going to come home. And they put their lives on hold. They fought and liberated all those countries and reunited many families. And when the war was over, they carried it home with them with frozen feet and shrapnel and nightmares. And I'd ask them, I'd say, if you knew that you were going to have the effects of frozen feet for over 70 years, would you do it again? And pretty much every one of them says, yes, I would do it again, even knowing that for 70 plus years, I would have these effects of the war, because they believed in our country, they loved our flag, and they believed in liberating the people of Europe and the Pacific ultimately too. So I think that's why Tom Brokaw called them the greatest generation. And I appreciate you taking the time. I'm sorry it was so rushed, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen and hear their stories and help us remember these wonderful heroes. So this is a picture of me at the Eagle's Nest at Birch's Garden, where Hitler often met with world leaders. And if you were to turn off to my side, the picture on the right was another angle of what I was seeing there on that June day up in the mountains in the Alps. So anyhow, I don't know if you have any questions or if you're awake. But I hope that wasn't too overwhelming. I know that was kind of a tidal wave, but people have written books about this thing, and I just wanted to cover as much as I could in a short period of time.
Thank you, Jim. I don't know if anybody else has any questions, but my father was in a Sherman tank in the Battle of the Bulge, and it was very cold. He said he was never so cold in his life. The inside of his tank, because they didn't have heaters, was coated with 2 to 3 inches of ice through the entire battle. Could you speak a little bit to the German 88s? You mentioned those a little bit. I know those were one of the most fearsome weapons for our troops.
Well, you know, they fired a little farther than you know, some of our other equipment. I know that I spoke with one of the mortar individuals, different from the man I mentioned here, a man named Sid Wells. And I know you didn't ask about mortars, but you just made me think about something Sid Wells said. Sid's mortar battalion was able to fire so rapidly. They were so good at their training and what they did that they captured some German prisoners, and the Germans asked where we got the automatic mortars from. They thought we had invented some new type of mortar, and it was actually the efficiency of that mortar crew. They were so excellent at what they did. But you know, when I talked to soldiers about the 88s, they just said, you know, that they were just so accurate, and they just wreaked so much havoc. You know, you could angle them to fire up at low flying planes. You could angle them at a tank. You could angle them at troops. They just were, you know, very versatile weapon. And the Germans were just really good with them. They dreaded the 88s, 88 you know, an 88 millimeter shell is why they were called 88s. But yeah, the soldiers I talked to just really dreaded the 88s. They said they were deadly accurate. That's really about all I know about the 88s. Although I will tell you, one of the German soldiers I interviewed was given, I don't think it was quite an 88, but he was given an anti-aircraft gun and told to guard the Mercedes-Benz factory. And he said that his gun would fire 6,000 feet in the air, and our bombers were coming over at 25,000 feet. So he said that it was hopeless, that they would try to fire at our planes, but ultimately they were just seeking shelter because their guns wouldn't fire as high as our planes were. And they would have to just duck because the factory was going to get bombed anyway. Something interesting was early in the war, one of the German officials said, maybe we should put our factories underground. And he was seen as unpatriotic. They said, what do you mean put our factories underground? You know, the Luftwaffe, our Air Force, and our, you know, all our flak and anti-aircraft guns will never let any enemy planes over our factories. And boy, should they have listened to that guy instead of bashing him that he was unpatriotic, because we leveled so many of their factories. It was just incredible. And, you know, here at home, our factories were just humming right along. You know, places like the Eureka vacuum cleaner company were producing gas masks, and, you know, Anheuser-Busch was producing, you know, parts for Jeeps and planes and foodstuffs and you know, it's just amazing all the different corporations that retooled, which is another thing special about this generation, because, you know, if Eureka is not making vacuums, then you can't go buy a new vacuum. You've got to try and fix the old one, you know, because they're making gas masks. So it's just, we don't think about the effects of retooling for the war and how it taught people to make do with what they had. You know, you really had to struggle to make do. So are there any other thoughts or questions? I will tell you too, I have a friend that's still living. He'll be 101 in October, and he was a bombardier with the 8th Air Force. And I call him every week, and I try to go see him as often as I can too. And he flew on the Ploesti, first group of planes in at the Ploesti oil fields in Romania. And he said that the trees and the smokestacks and things, that they went up to about 200 feet. And, you know, they flew in at 250 feet over the target, trying to be under the flak. And it's just incredible to hear his stories and that he lived through those kind of bombing raids. I mean, imagine, you know, the oil fields are so heavily protected, and he's flying at 250 feet in a B-24 bomber. Just incredible, you know, the things they did. So are there any other questions about the war or thoughts, or, you know, would you like to know where to donate money to the War Memorial? Or no, I'm teasing about that. I'm not here for money. I am here to honor those men and women that serve, though, and I hope I'm doing a good job at that.
You know, this is Phil Tobin here, and I really want to express my appreciation, I think, for all of us on what you're doing to pass this memory on to younger children, because it is so important, and they're so much interested in learning about World War II and how their grandfathers and their uncles, in my case, my brothers. One brother was landed in Normandy. The other one was on a munitions ship going over and bringing prisoner of wars back. The other one was on Iwo Jima in the Navy and was hit by kamikaze planes. These are stories that'll just disappear unless this message is passed on. And I really applaud what you're doing to teach the younger children about what life was like
Well,
during the war.
I thank you for that, and I'm doing my best. It reminds me of, I had a student once whose father was serving over in Iraq several years ago. And the student told me one day, she said, you know what, while my dad is over there fighting, she said, reading these letters and stories about the World War II generation gives me comfort because I saw what they went through and they made it through. So I know I'm going to make it through too, you know, and I loved it that she connected with the World War II generation to help her in, you know, in the 21st century in our war in Iraq. So that was really impressive. I saw a question come up about, well, whose flag is that behind me? That is actually an extra flag. One of the things over in my corner over here, when people retire flags, they come to me, and then I have them go to the military where they're retired appropriately, you know, with respect. They follow a ceremony on retiring the flags. But we often work with a funeral home, a local funeral home, who will occasionally, if you turn in your flag, the funeral home will actually present you with a brand new flag, which I think is a really awesome service. And the flag behind me was an unused one from the funeral home. So it is a coffin flag, but it did not appear on a coffin. My father-in-law is buried in Arlington, and we do have his flag at home in a frame, you know, in a box from his coffin at Arlington. But so thank you for asking about the flag. Is it Ed?
Yeah.
Ed, what can I do for you?
Just real quickly, a little bit of Hudson history about Dante Lavelli, who ended up as a star receiver for the Cleveland Browns and is in the Football Hall of Fame. He was at Ohio State in 1942. Paul Brown left Ohio State as the coach to enter the war. Dante did shortly after. He served in the Army as an infantryman, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge. And his recollection was sitting in a foxhole and saying the Our Father over and over again during that battle. And again, he was a local hero and very proud of his service during that particular battle.
Well, we here at the War Memorial think it's important to share those names. We think that, you know, as long as we can repeat their names and tell the stories and who they were, then they're not really gone. They're still with us. And we think that's really important. So I'm glad you shared that. I did want to tell you all about a woman named Mrs. Taylor that actually lived in Ohio. She would eventually work at Kent State University. But during the war, she was sent to work in an airplane factory. And her job as a Rosie the Riveter was to lay inside the tail of the airplane. And as the rivets came through, she had to flatten them out on the inside. And I would tell students, you know, this is before there was air conditioning, you know, and you're in a hot, noisy, laying inside an airplane tail, having to flatten things out. You know, it's hot, it's noisy. And one thing that she loved is when she got her first paycheck, she was told that money should go toward war bonds, you know, that every good American would buy war bonds. And that was true. They really should. But she said, wow, for the first time in my life, I had independence. I had some of my own money. She goes, I saved my first paychecks and I bought a mink coat. So she was so proud of that mink coat. She said after that, she bought plenty of war bonds, but that first money was going to be hers, that she had earned it. And I always loved that story from her, you know, and she said they gave her such a hard time when she bought that mink coat, but she said, nope, I earned it. So.
She was an American, right? Independent American.
Definitely.
I love that
hardworking, and you know, she was doing her duty. She wasn't being selfish.
Not at all.
I loved that about her. Yeah, we've lost her also, but you know, that's the hard thing for me. We go through a span now where almost every week I learn of another veteran passing. And, you know, I celebrate that they've lived into their 90s and early hundreds and celebrate that we've gotten to know them. But it's still sad because I know that I'm going to turn around one day and all those voices are going to be silent. And it's getting closer and I'm dreading that day.
Well, thank you, Mr. Trussell. This was
You're welcome.
absolutely wonderful. It's truly a joy to hear you. And I've been keeping track of all of the names that you have mentioned and displayed in your presentation. I agree with you. It is terribly important that we acknowledge them and realize that it is individuals that make up troops, that make up regiments, that make up battalions. It is individuals fighting as a unit together that actually save our country. And so thank you again for a wonderful presentation. This was really awesome.
You're
And-
very welcome. Thank you, Ms. Orr. And we use a lot of things, newspaper clippings, anything we can find to put in students' hands to use as a tool to teach. Things that a lot of people, buttons, pins, things you might not think were important. We use them for education. So if you ever come across things you want to get rid of, send them our way, because we'll put them in the hands of students and help educate. So thank you all very much for your time and what you do for your community. And I just hope you all have a great day and a wonderful summer.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, that concludes our meeting today. It was truly a wonderful experience to hear from him. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone next Wednesday evening, June 30th at the Twinsburg Blue Canyon. And we'll have a great night to close this year out. So thank you. I think we're going to stop recording soon. James, you want to?